He didn't throw a single punch that day, and by the time the video hit 2 million views, half the internet was begging him to. A bully picked the wrong freshman to humiliate in front of 400 witnesses, and what nobody in that cafeteria knew was that the quiet kid in the corner had knocked out grown men for a living. This is the story of the day silence stopped being mistaken for weakness. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. If this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because next week I've got a story lined up that might be the most satisfying one I've ever told. Now let's get into it. Lincoln High School sat on the east side of Cleveland, a squat brick building from the 1960s that had seen 3 renovations and still smelled like floor wax and old paper in the hallways. October had settled in cold and gray over the city, the kind of Cleveland autumn where the wind off the lake cut through a jacket like it wasn't there. Inside, though, the cafeteria at 1215 was its own climate entirely. Loud, bright under buzzing fluorescent tubes, 400 teenagers packed into rows of long tables, trays clattering, laughter bouncing off cinder block walls painted a color the district called Lincoln blue that had faded to something closer to gray. Marcus Webb sat where he always sat, third table from the back wall, closest to the exit, facing the room. Not because he wanted to watch everyone, because his coach had taught him 3 years ago, in a gym that smelled like sweat and bleach, that you never sit with your back to a room you don't fully trust yet. Old habits. Marcus was 15, tall for his age, but not in an obvious way, the kind of tall that only registered when he stood up next to someone. He wore a plain gray hoodie, the sleeves pushed up just enough to show forearms that didn't match the rest of him, corded and defined in a way that had nothing to do with genetics, and everything to do with 4 years of heavy bag work starting at 5:30 every morning. He didn't talk much. Not because he was shy. He wasn't, not really, but because he'd learned that talking drew attention, and attention was the one thing he'd been told, over and over, to avoid. School is school. Boxing is boxing. You keep those two things separate, Marcus, or one of them is going to cost you the other. His mother's voice, and behind it, his coach's voice, saying nearly the same thing in gruffer words. So Marcus ate his lunch. He did his homework in the 15 minutes before class. He answered when called on and said nothing when he wasn't. To 400 kids at Lincoln High, he was just the quiet kid. The new kid, still, even 2 months into the school year, because nobody could remember the last time he'd said more than 10 words in a row. What none of them knew, what he'd been told, in no uncertain terms, never to bring up, was that outside those brick walls, Marcus Webb was 19-0. Junior Olympic gold medalist. A name that regional boxing coaches were already saying out loud to each other at tournaments, the kind of prospect people used the word special for when they thought he wasn't listening. His hands were, in the most literal legal sense his coach could put it, registered weapons. And weapons didn't belong in cafeteria arguments. Tyler Brennan had never once looked twice at Marcus before that Tuesday. Tyler was a sophomore, technically, though this was his second year in the grade, a fact he'd turned into a kind of seniority rather than a source of embarrassment. He was broad-shouldered, loud in the particular way that came from never once having to earn a room's attention, because the room had always just given it to him. His father, Dale Brennan, ran Brennan Construction, the company whose name was stenciled on half the dumpsters and equipment trailers parked around district buildings, a fact Tyler brought up more than anyone had ever asked him to. Tyler held court at the center table in the cafeteria, the one closest to the vending machines, surrounded by 3 or 4 boys who laughed a beat too fast at everything he said. Cruelty, for Tyler, wasn't a decision. It was a bit. A performance he did for an audience that had learned to expect it, the way you'd expect a comedian to hit his usual bits on a Tuesday set. He picked targets the way a director picks extras, quickly, instinctively, based on who wouldn't push back. And on that particular Tuesday, weaving back from the lunch line with his tray, laughing at something one of his friends had said, Tyler's eyes landed on the quiet kid at the third table. The one who never talked. The one who, Tyler realized with the kind of idle curiosity that would define the next several weeks of both their lives, he had never actually heard say a single word. "Yo," Tyler said, loud enough for the tables around him to catch it, stepping into Marcus's path with his tray angled just slightly, testing. "You even talk, man? Or you just sit there?" Marcus looked up. Didn't answer right away, not out of fear, not out of anything Tyler could name. Just a stillness that Tyler had never encountered before and didn't know how to read. A few kids at the surrounding tables had already stopped eating, sensing, the way teenagers always do, that something was starting. "I talk," Marcus said finally. Even quiet, no edge to it at all. Tyler grinned, glancing back at his friends like he'd just won something. "Could have fooled me." He said something else after that, something about Marcus being the ghost kid, something that got a laugh from his table. But Marcus had already looked back down at his tray, unbothered, already moving past it the way he moved past most things. He didn't know yet that this was the beginning, that Tyler Brennan, having found a reaction he couldn't get, was the kind of person who would keep pushing precisely because he couldn't get one. Marcus picked up his fork. Across the cafeteria, the bell for fifth period hadn't rung yet, and Tyler Brennan was already turning back toward his own table, already deciding, without knowing it, exactly how far he was about to take this. Wednesday came gray and colder, the kind of Cleveland sky that never quite committed to rain, but threatened it all day long. Marcus went through his morning the way he went through every morning, up at 5:15, 3 miles before the sun, 45 minutes on the heavy bag at Eastside Boxing Gym before Coach Doss even unlocked the front door, then home to shower and make it to first period with 2 minutes to spare. Nobody at Lincoln High knew about any of it. To them, he was just the kid who sometimes looked a little tired in first period history, and nobody thought much more about it than that. By lunchtime, the exchange with Tyler from the day before had mostly faded from Marcus's mind. It hadn't felt like anything, really, some kid running his mouth, the way kids at every school in America ran their mouths at somebody quieter than them. Marcus had been on the receiving end of it before at his old school in Akron, before his family moved for his mother's job. He knew how to let it roll past him. He didn't get anywhere in boxing or in life by reacting to every jab someone threw just to see if you'd flinch. He got in the lunch line a few minutes after noon, tray in hand, moving through the slow shuffle toward the hot bar. Today, it was some version of chicken patty sandwich, a scoop of corn, an apple that had seen better days. The line curved past the drink cooler, tight with bodies, backpacks. The general chaos of 400 teenagers trying to eat in 45 minutes. Marcus didn't see Tyler until it was already happening. He felt it before he understood it. A foot hooking across his ankle, low and deliberate, timed to the exact half-second where his weight was already shifting forward to step. There was no recovering from an angle like that, not with a tray in both hands and no free hand to catch himself. Marcus went down hard, tray first, the chicken patty sandwich and corn and little carton of milk exploding across the cafeteria floor in a spray that reached the sneakers of at least 6 people standing nearby. The sound of the tray hitting tile cracked through the cafeteria like a gunshot, and for a half-second, the entire room seemed to freeze mid-chew. Then the laughter started. Tyler stood a few feet back, tray held easily at his side, grinning like he'd just landed the punchline of the year. "My bad, man," he said, not sounding sorry at all, playing to the crowd that had already turned to look. "Didn't see you down there. You gotta speak up more, maybe people would notice you." More laughter. A couple of phones were already out, angled low, the way teenagers had learned to film without looking like they were filming. Marcus lay there for exactly 1 second longer than he needed to. Not stunned. He'd taken worse falls in sparring, worse hits than a scraped palm and a bruised knee from cold cafeteria tile. He was doing what his coach had drilled into him 1,000 times before every fight. Breathe, assess, control the moment before the moment controls you. Then he pushed himself up, unhurried, brushed a smear of corn off his sleeve, and knelt down to start gathering the pieces of his shattered tray back onto it. The napkins, the cracked milk carton, the sandwich that had skidded halfway under the next table. "You good?" A kid nearby, someone Marcus didn't know, offered him a hand up. Marcus took it, nodded once. "Yeah, thanks." He didn't look at Tyler, didn't say anything to him at all. He simply stood, tray in hand, and walked toward the trash cans at the edge of the cafeteria to dump what was left of his lunch, his expression unreadable, his shoulders loose and easy the entire way, like a man walking to his car in a parking lot rather than a boy who'd just been publicly tripped in front of his entire grade. That, more than anything, was what got under Tyler's skin. He'd expected something, anger, embarrassment, some flush of color in the face, a mumbled comeback he could talk over. He'd gotten a target who'd stood up, cleaned up his own mess, and walked away without so much as a glance back. It didn't read as fear to the handful of people paying close attention. It read as something closer to indifference, and indifference to someone like Tyler Brennan was the one reaction he couldn't stand. "That's cold, bro," one of Tyler's friends said, laughing, clapping him on the shoulder. Kid didn't even say nothing. "He's weird," Tyler said, but there was an edge in his voice now that hadn't been there a moment ago. Something working underneath the grin. Kid's got no reaction to anything. "Watch, I bet I could dump his whole tray on him and he wouldn't say a word." Nobody at that table took it as a real plan. It was just Tyler talking, the way Tyler always talked, building the bit for tomorrow's audience. But 3 tables away, a junior named Priya Anand had watched the whole thing happen. Watched Marcus go down, watched him get up without a flicker of anger crossing his face, watched Tyler play it for laughs like it was nothing. She didn't know Marcus, had maybe exchanged 2 words with him in the hallway all semester. But something about the calm on his face as he'd cleaned up his own lunch off the floor stuck with her in a way she couldn't quite name yet. She didn't say anything, just watched him sit back down at his usual table, alone, and go back to eating the apple that had survived the fall, like nothing at all had happened. It wouldn't be the last time. Word travels fast in a high school cafeteria, faster than almost anywhere else on earth. And by Thursday morning the story of the kid Tyler tripped who didn't even say anything had made its way through most of the freshman and sophomore class in one form or another. Some versions made Marcus out to be scared. A few, whispered by kids who'd actually watched his face when he stood back up, made him out to be something else entirely, something the tellers didn't quite have a word for yet. Tyler heard all of it, and none of it satisfied him. He'd built his reputation over 2 years on being the loudest voice in any room he walked into. And for 2 years that had worked exactly as intended. Kids either laughed with him or got out of his way. Marcus Webb had done neither. He hadn't laughed, hadn't gotten angry, hadn't gotten out of the way. He'd simply absorbed it and kept moving, like water going around a rock. And something about that refusal to react had lodged itself under Tyler's skin in a way he didn't have the self-awareness to name. So over the following week, what had started as a single tripping incident became something with a rhythm to it. A shoulder check in the hallway between 3rd and 4th period, hard enough to send Marcus's books sliding across the floor, followed by an exaggerated, "Oh my bad," loud enough for a crowd. A muttered "speak up" ghost every time Tyler passed him. Little things, individually deniable, each one calibrated to draw some kind of reaction that never came. Marcus said nothing to his mother about any of it. Said nothing to Coach Doss, either, though the coach noticed. On Thursday, working the mitts, he caught something in Marcus's jab that was a half beat sharper than usual, more force behind it than the drill called for. "Ease up," Doss said, catching one of the pads against his ribs. "You're not fighting nobody in here, you're training." "Where's that coming from?" "Nowhere," Marcus said and reset his stance, and Doss let it go. Because Marcus wasn't a kid who lied easily. And if he said it was nothing, Doss trusted there was a reason he needed it to stay nothing a little while longer. By the following Tuesday, 1 week to the day since the first trip, Tyler had an audience primed for something bigger. He'd been building toward it without fully admitting to himself that he was building toward anything. The way a bit escalates on its own gravity once enough people are watching for the next installment. He got in line behind Marcus at lunch, tray loaded heavier than usual. A bowl of chili, 2 cartons of milk, a full plate of nachos he'd grabbed on top of his regular tray. An obvious excess that only made sense in hindsight. Marcus felt him coming before he saw him. The way you learn to feel a punch coming in the ring half a second before your eyes even confirm it. Some shift in the air, in the rhythm of footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around fast enough, and he didn't need to. Tyler wasn't hiding what he was about to do. "Yo, ghost," Tyler said, and tipped the tray. The chili came first, a wide brown wave of it across Marcus's shoulder and down the front of his hoodie, followed by the nachos, cheese, and crumbled chips sliding down his sleeve, and then almost gratuitously, one of the milk cartons opened and poured straight over the crown of his head, running down through his hair and along his jaw and dripping onto the floor between his sneakers. The cafeteria didn't laugh right away this time. For a beat, it was too much, even by the standards of an audience that had been primed for something. Then someone did laugh, and it broke the tension, and more laughter followed, uncertain and cruel and contagious the way it always is in a room full of teenagers who don't want to be the one who does a laugh. Phones were already up. Not a couple this time, a dozen easily, angled and steady, capturing every second of it in high definition. Marcus stood still through all of it. Chili sliding down his collarbone, milk dripping off his chin, nacho cheese cooling against his neck. He didn't flinch, didn't raise a hand to wipe any of it away, didn't so much as blink harder than usual. What he did do, and this was the part that would end up mattering more than anything else, the part that would get slowed down and replayed and captioned 1,000 different ways online within 48 hours, was turn calmly toward the small freshman standing just behind him in line, a boy named Kevin Ostrander who'd stumbled backward out of the splash zone and gone down hard onto one knee, his own tray scattering across the floor in the commotion. Marcus reached down, milk still dripping from his fingers, and helped Kevin up, steadied him by the shoulder until he was sure the kid had his footing, picked up Kevin's fallen tray and set it back on the table nearest them, said something quiet to him that the nearest phone microphone barely caught. Asterisk, you good? Here, sit down, asterisk. And then only then walked toward the bathroom to clean himself off, leaving a trail of chili and milk across the cafeteria tile behind him, saying nothing to Tyler at all, not so much as a glance in his direction. The laughter in the cafeteria had already started dying by the time he reached the door. Something about the sequence, the humiliation, and then the quiet, unbothered decency toward someone else in the middle of it, had shifted the room's temperature in a way nobody could quite articulate yet, though Priya Anand, watching from 3 tables away for the second time in a week, understood it perfectly. She wasn't the one who posted the video that night, but by the time she woke up Wednesday morning, somebody else already had, and it had 11,000 views before first period even started. By Wednesday morning, the video had a name attached to it that nobody at Lincoln High had given it. Someone online had captioned it, "Kid gets humiliated, doesn't even react," and it had done what videos like that do, spreading fast through the particular ecosystem of local Cleveland social media accounts that reposted anything with a hint of drama in it. 11,000 views by first period became 60,000 by lunch. By the time school let out, it had crossed 200,000, and the comments underneath it had started to shift in a direction nobody at Lincoln High had anticipated. Asterisk, why does this kid move like that? Watch how he catches his balance before he even hits the ground. That ain't normal. Asterisk. Asterisk, something about him helping that other kid up while covered in chili got me. He's built different. Asterisk. Asterisk, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I've seen this kid before. I think he boxes? Asterisk. That last comment, posted by an account with a small following that covered regional amateur sports, was the one that mattered. It came from a man named Frank Delgado, a freelance sports reporter who covered Golden Gloves and USA boxing regional events for a handful of local outlets around Northeast Ohio. Frank had been in the crowd at the Ohio Regional Championships back in August, camera in hand, when a 15-year-old out of Cleveland named Marcus Webb had gone the distance in the 132-pound novice to open bracket and put away his opponent in the 3rd round with a body shot combination that Frank still had saved on his phone. Frank didn't forget faces easily. It was half his job not to. And something about the stillness in this cafeteria video, the total lack of panic in the kid's body, even face down on tile, had nagged at him all through Wednesday afternoon until he pulled up his own regional footage and confirmed it side by side. Same jaw, same stance, even standing still in a lunch line. Same kid. Frank made a phone call to Lincoln High School around 1:40 that Wednesday afternoon, identifying himself to the front office as a sports reporter trying to confirm whether a student named Marcus Webb attended the school and whether the school was aware of who, in the amateur boxing world, at least, he actually was. The timing could not have been worse or better, depending on which side of the office door you were standing on. Principal Denise Carver had scheduled a disciplinary meeting for 1:45 that same afternoon. Called after Assistant Principal Reyes had spent the morning fielding 3 separate phone calls from parents who'd seen the cafeteria video and wanted to know what the school intended to do about it. Carver, in her first year running Lincoln High after 8 years in the district's disciplinary office downtown, had already reviewed the footage twice. She didn't need much more than that. She called Tyler Brennan down to her office, And because Ohio State Code required parental notification for suspensions of this length, Tyler's father, Dale Brennan, had driven straight over from a job site in his Brennan construction pickup, still in his work boots, visibly irritated at being pulled away. "This is a kid being a kid," Dale said, before Carver had even finished laying out the video timeline on her desk. "You're going to suspend him over a lunch tray? Come on, Denise." "It's Principal Carver," she said evenly. "And it's not one incident, Mr. Brennan. It's a pattern, a week of it on video, with your son's face clearly visible in every frame." She turned her laptop screen toward him, paused on the moment of the milk pouring over Marcus's head. "I'd ask you to watch it again before you tell me this is nothing." Dale's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, the office phone rang, the front desk, patching through a call Carver hadn't been expecting. She excused herself for a moment, picked it up, and listened as Frank Delgado explained, calmly and clearly, exactly who he believed Marcus Webb was, and asked whether the school had any comment on the fact that the boy in the viral video was, by his count, an undefeated amateur boxer with a junior Olympic gold medal, being bullied for weeks without once raising a hand in his own defense. Carver's expression didn't change much, but something in her posture straightened. She hadn't even finished thanking Frank for the call when the office door opened without a knock, and Coach Ray Doss walked in, gray East Side boxing windbreaker, a manila folder held against his chest like something precious. He'd seen the video that morning, same as everyone else, and he'd recognized his own fighter instantly. And he'd spent the rest of the day deciding that whatever promise he'd made about keeping boxing and school separate didn't apply anymore, not when the school itself didn't know what it was dealing with. Denise, Doss said they knew each other from a district athletics committee 2 years back. "I need 5 minutes. I think you've got some information missing here." He set the folder down on her desk and opened it. USA Boxing Registration, a laminated record card with Marcus's name, and a clean line of 19 wins and 0 losses, a photograph from the regional championship podium, gold medal around a 15-year-old's neck, expression as calm in victory as it had been face down on Cafeteria tile a week earlier. Dale Brennan leaned forward to look, and for the first time since walking into the office, he didn't say anything at all. Principal Carver looked at the folder, then up at Tyler, who had gone very quiet in the chair by the window, the confident slouch he'd walked in with entirely gone. "I think," Carver said slowly, closing the folder, "we're going to need to have a very different conversation than the one I planned for this afternoon." Principal Carver asked Coach Doss to stay. She didn't ask Dale Brennan if he minded. She simply set the terms of the room and let everyone adjust to them, which was, Doss thought, exactly the kind of quiet authority that made her good at this job. "Let's start with what we actually know," Carver said, pulling the laptop back toward herself and opening a second document alongside the paused video. A disciplinary timeline Assistant Principal Reyes had compiled that morning from cafeteria staff reports, hallway camera footage, and 3 written statements from students, including one from Priya Anand that was more detailed and more damning than anything Carver had expected from a junior who barely knew either boy involved. October 14th, a tripping incident in the lunch line, witnessed by cafeteria staff. October 16th through the 21st, a pattern of what multiple students describe as targeted harassment, hallway shoves, comments, at least 4 separate incidents. October 22nd, the tray incident, now viewed, she checked the counter, for 110,000 times as of this morning, with Tyler clearly identifiable initiating physical contact and dumping food on another student while other students filmed and laughed. "He never touched him," Dale said, but the fight had mostly gone out of his voice. "There's a difference between horseplay and—" "Mr. Brennan." Carver didn't raise her voice. She'd learned a long time ago in the district office that raising your voice in a room like this only gave the other person permission to raise theirs back. Your son poured chili and a full carton of milk over another student's head in front of 400 witnesses, on the heels of a week of documented harassment against that same student. "I'm not interested in what we call it. I'm interested in what we do about it." Tyler hadn't said a word since Doss had walked in with the folder. He sat with his hands pressed flat against his knees, staring at a spot on the carpet somewhere between his own feet and the desk, and for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, he looked like exactly what he was, a 16-year-old who'd badly misjudged something and was only now understanding the size of the misjudgment. Here's what could happen, Carver continued, and she began item by item, laying it out the way she'd learned to during 8 years of exactly this kind of conversation. Tyler will serve a 10-day out-of-school suspension, effective tomorrow, per the district's harassment policy. This qualifies as a pattern, not an isolated incident, which changes the consequence tier. He's removed from student council effective immediately. I've already spoken with the council advisor. He's barred from all extracurricular activities for the remainder of the semester, which I understand includes basketball tryouts next month. She glanced up briefly, registering the flicker that crossed Tyler's face at that, the first real reaction he'd shown since sitting down. And he'll be required to complete a conflict resolution counseling program through the district before he's eligible to return to any of those activities in the spring. 10 days, Dale repeated, like the number itself was an insult. For a school lunch thing that got out of hand. For weeks of targeted bullying against a student who, by every account I have, did nothing to provoke it, Carver said. A student who, and I want to be very clear about this part, Mr. Brennan, has now been publicly humiliated on video that's approaching 500,000 views, none of which was his choice or his doing. It was Doss who spoke next, quiet, but with the particular weight of a man who'd spent 30 years in gyms where reputation was the only currency that mattered. You want to talk about what your son's actions might cost, he said to Dale. Let's talk about what they've already cost. That boy's name is out there, now attached to a story he never wanted told. Every college scout, every Olympic development coach who was already circling him, they've all seen this. Doesn't matter that he's the one who comes out looking good in it. He didn't get a choice in any of it, and neither did his family. Dale opened his mouth to respond, and then, visibly, thought better of it. Something in his posture had shifted since he'd first walked in. The irritation of a man pulled off a job site had curdled into something closer to dread, and Carver suspected she knew exactly why. She'd read the morning news alert on her way into the building. Brennan Construction was already the subject of a district facilities review after 2 botched roofing jobs the previous spring, and a viral video tying the Brennan name to a bullying scandal was not the kind of publicity a company under investigation needed. There's one more thing, Carver said, closing the laptop. I've already had calls this morning from 2 local news outlets asking whether the school has a statement on the video. I intend to give one, a brief one, focused on the district's response and the steps we're taking, without naming any student involved. What happens with your family's name after that is not something I control, and I'd encourage you to think carefully about how you handle the next few days. Tyler finally looked up, not at his father, not at Carver, but at Coach Doss, standing by the door with the folder still under his arm. He's really 19 and oh, he asked, voice smaller than anything he'd said all week. Like actually? 19 and oh, Doss confirmed. Junior Olympic champion. And he never once threw a punch at you, even though I guarantee you he could have ended that whole thing in under a second if he'd wanted to. He let that sit for a moment. That's not luck, son. That's discipline. Something you might want to think about. Nobody in the room had anything to add to that. Dale Brennan stood, jaw tight, and reached for his son's shoulder, not gently exactly, but with something that looked, for the first time that afternoon, like genuine concern rather than performance. Carver watched them go, then turned back to her screen, to the paused frame of Marcus Webb standing calm and still under a stream of spilled milk, and reached for her phone to call his mother. The local news picked it up faster than Principal Carver had expected. By Thursday evening, WKYC had run a 90-second segment on the 6 o'clock broadcast. Cleveland teens restraint goes viral amid bullying investigation. Careful not to name any student per the district request, but showing blurred clips of the cafeteria video anyway, alongside a brief statement from the school district's communications office about its zero-tolerance policy on harassment and commitment to student safety. It wasn't a long segment. It didn't need to be. By Friday morning, 3 other outlets had picked up the story, and one enterprising local blog had connected threads nobody at the school had explicitly confirmed, reporting correctly that the family at the center of the bullying incident shared a name with Brennan Construction, the contracting company already under a district facilities review for substandard roofing work at 2 elementary schools the previous spring. The story didn't need the school's confirmation once that connection was public. Comment sections do the rest on their own. By Monday, a follow-up article in the Plain Dealer's local news section laid it out plainly. Brennan Construction's contract for district facilities maintenance, up for renewal that winter, would not be renewed. The district statement was carefully worded, citing ongoing concerns regarding contract performance rather than the bullying incident directly. But nobody reading it needed the connection spelled out. Dale Brennan's business, built over 11 years into one of the more reliable names in local school contracting, had lost its largest and most consistent client in the space of a single week, and the phone calls Dale had been fielding from other prospective clients since Friday had grown noticeably quieter. Inside Lincoln High, the fallout moved differently, but it moved. Principal Carver hadn't forgotten about the phones that had been out that day in the cafeteria, the dozen or so students who'd filmed instead of stepping in, who'd laughed along instead of helping Kevin Ostrander up off the floor or telling Tyler to knock it off. She called a meeting that Monday with 4 of them, the ones whose footage had circulated most widely, along with Assistant Principal Reyes and the school counselor. It wasn't a punitive meeting, not in the way Tyler's had been. None of them had thrown food or tripped anyone, but Carver made clear it wasn't nothing, either. You don't have to be the one holding the tray to be part of what happened, she told them. For teenagers sitting uncomfortably around a conference table that suddenly felt too small, filming somebody's humiliation and posting it for views is its own choice. I'm not suspending anyone in this room, but I am asking each of you to be part of something we're building here starting this semester so that the next time something like this starts, it doesn't get this far before somebody steps in. None of the 4 fully understood yet what she meant by that. It would take another month before they did. Priya Anand hadn't been called into that meeting. She hadn't filmed anything, hadn't laughed, had in fact been the one to quietly forward her own written account to Assistant Principal Reyes the day after the video went viral, unprompted, describing in detail what she'd watched happen over the preceding week. She found Marcus in the library that Monday afternoon, the first time either of them had spoken more than a passing word to each other. "Hey," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I don't know if you know, but I wrote a statement about what I saw. I should have said something a week ago, when he tripped you the first time. I'm sorry I didn't." Marcus looked up from his homework, studied her for a moment with the same unreadable stillness he brought to most things, then nodded once. "You said something now," he said. "That's more than a lot of people did." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, or absolution. Priya hadn't asked for either. But something about the simplicity of his answer stayed with her longer than she expected it to. At home that week, Marcus's mother, Denise Webb, had her own reckoning to manage. A school counselor's phone call, a wave of messages from relatives and old family friends who'd seen the video shared, a local news producer requesting an interview that she politely declined on her son's behalf. She sat with Marcus at the kitchen table Sunday night. The video paused on her laptop screen at the exact frame where he'd helped Kevin Ostrander back to his feet, milk still dripping from his chin. "You didn't hit him," she said. "Not a question." "No, ma'am." Even after the second time, even after the milk. She studied his face, looking, Marcus understood, for whatever she needed to see to know he was really as okay as he seemed. "I know what I told you. School and boxing, separate. I need you to know I meant that to protect you, not because I thought you couldn't handle yourself." "I know that." Marcus met her eyes. "I wasn't tempted, if that's what you're asking. Not once." She believed him, had believed him from the start, if she was honest, because Marcus Webb had never once in his life given her a reason not to. But hearing him say it plainly, without any performance in it at all, eased something in her chest that had been tight since the first call from the school counselor. Whatever came next, whatever the video did to his name in the wider world, her son had done exactly what he'd been asked to do, and had done it without flinching once. 3 days later, Tyler Brennan would knock on their front door. Tyler had never been to Marcus's neighborhood before. It sat on the opposite side of the district from where he lived, a stretch of modest brick 2 stories on the east side, closer to the boxing gym than to anywhere Tyler usually spent his time. And he'd had to ask his father, awkwardly, for a ride there on the 6th day of his suspension, without fully explaining why. Dale had driven him, without much conversation, parked the truck across the street, and told him he'd wait, which was as close as Dale Brennan had come in a week to saying anything supportive about the situation at all. Tyler stood on the porch for nearly a full minute before he knocked. He'd rehearsed something in his head on the drive over, some version of an apology that sounded better in his imagination than it did the moment Denise Webb opened the door and looked at him with an expression that wasn't hostile, exactly, but wasn't inviting either. "Is Marcus home?" Tyler asked. "I wanted to talk to him, if that's okay." She studied him for a long moment, long enough that Tyler nearly turned around and left before she stepped back and called Marcus's name up the stairs. Marcus came down in sweatpants and a t-shirt, clearly having interrupted something. Homework, maybe, or just an ordinary Thursday evening, and stopped a few steps from the bottom of the staircase when he saw who was standing in his doorway. His mother hovered nearby, but didn't intervene, watching from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, close enough to hear everything. "Can we talk outside?" Tyler asked. For a minute, they stood on the porch together, the streetlight just starting to flicker on against the early dusk, Tyler shifting his weight from foot to foot in a way that looked nothing like the boy who'd commanded a cafeteria with a single loud comment 3 weeks earlier. "I've been thinking about what to say for like a week," Tyler started, and then seemed to abandon whatever he'd rehearsed entirely. "I don't even know how to. I didn't know. About the boxing, I mean. Not that it would have mattered, I guess that's not." He stopped, exhaled hard, tried again. "I'm sorry. For all of it. The tripping, the food, all the stuff before that. I don't even really know why I started with you in the first place. You never did anything to me." Marcus listened without interrupting, arms loose at his sides, expression the same unreadable calm he'd carried through every single moment of the last 3 weeks, through the tray hitting the floor, through the milk running down his collar, through all of it. It wasn't coldness. Tyler could tell, standing there, that it wasn't coldness. It was just Marcus, entirely himself, giving Tyler exactly the same attention he'd have given anyone. "I lost basketball," Tyler continued, when Marcus didn't say anything right away. "Student council. My dad's company lost the district contract. You probably heard that part. Everybody has. I'm not telling you that so you feel bad. I wanted you to know I get it. That this actually cost me something. It wasn't just some suspension I sat out and forgot about." "I heard," Marcus said finally, "about the contract. I'm sorry that happened to your dad's business, whatever anybody else did to cause it." Tyler blinked, clearly not expecting that. "You don't have to say that." "I know I don't." Marcus shrugged slightly. "But it's true. That's not the part one wanted for you. I never wanted anything bad to happen to your family. I just wanted you to stop." "I know," Tyler said quietly. "I know that now." There was a long pause between them, the kind that neither boy seemed in a hurry to fill. Down the street, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the porch and gone again. "Look," Marcus said eventually, and something in his voice, still calm, still even, carried a weight that hadn't been there a moment earlier. "I appreciate you coming here. I do. It took something to do that, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't." He held Tyler's gaze, steady. "But I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's all fixed because you said sorry once on my porch after everything came out. This isn't about one moment for me. It's about 3 weeks of watching you decide every single day that I was an easy target. And I wasn't even the first person you probably did that to. I heard things about other kids before me." Tyler's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, didn't deny it either. "I understand why you're here," Marcus continued. "And I believe you're sorry, at least right now, standing on my porch. But sorry's a start, not a finish line. If you actually mean it, you're going to have to show that with what you do next, not just with me, with everybody. That's not something I can just hand you tonight." It wasn't the forgiveness Tyler had hoped for walking up the driveway. It also wasn't the door slammed in his face that some smaller, guiltier part of him had half expected. It was something harder to sit with than either of those things, an open door with the terms laid out plainly, and no promise attached to it except the chance to prove something over time. "That's fair," Tyler said and meant it. "That's more than fair." He turned to go, then stopped at the top of the porch steps and looked back. "For what it's worth, I saw the boxing footage. The regional one from August. You're really good. Like actually really good." Marcus almost smiled at that, the first real crack in his composure all evening. "I know," he said simply, and went back inside, leaving Tyler standing alone on the porch steps in the last of the daylight, with a long walk back across the street to his father's truck and a longer road ahead of him than he'd fully understood when he'd knocked. 3 months later, by late January, Lincoln High School looked much the same from the outside. Same brick, same fluorescent-lit cafeteria, same faded Lincoln blue paint on the walls. But the room itself had changed in ways that weren't obvious from a single glance and became unmistakable if you spent any real time in it. The peer accountability program had started small, almost accidentally. Out of the 4 students Principal Carver had pulled into that uncomfortable conference room meeting back in October. What began as a mandatory conversation about bystander responsibility had, over the following weeks, turned into something more deliberate. A rotating group of student volunteers, trained by the school counselor and by Carver herself, whose job wasn't to police the cafeteria like hall monitors, but to actually notice, to sit with kids who were eating alone, to step in calmly, the moment something started tipping toward what had happened to Marcus, before it had the chance to become a pattern instead of a single bad afternoon. Marcus hadn't wanted to be the face of it, and Carver hadn't asked him to be. But when the program needed a name, it was one of the original 4 students, a sophomore named Dominic Reyes, no relation to the assistant principal, who suggested calling it the Third Table Initiative, after the seat Marcus had always chosen, closest to the exit, facing the room. Marcus had been embarrassed by it at first. He'd gotten used to it by January, mostly because he'd watched what it actually did, table by table, week by week. Ms. Alvarez, who'd taught freshman English at Lincoln High for 11 years and eaten her lunch in the corner of the cafeteria doing hall supervision duty for nearly as long, noticed the shift before most of the staff did. She mentioned it unprompted to Principal Carver during a hallway conversation in late January. "I've been walking that cafeteria for over a decade," she said. "I know what it sounds like when something's about to go bad, that specific kind of laughter, the way a crowd builds around it. I haven't heard it once since November. Kids are actually looking out for each other in there now. I didn't think I'd see that happen in a room this size." Kevin Ostrander, the freshman who'd gone down in the chili and milk incident back in October, had joined the Third Table volunteers in December, the first to sign up after the initial 4. He didn't talk about it much, but he told Dominic once, quietly, that he still thought about that day sometimes, about how it had been Marcus who checked on him instead of the other way around, and how he hadn't wanted to be the kind of person who let something like that just happen in front of him ever again. Tyler Brennan hadn't disappeared from Lincoln High, though there'd been a stretch in November where it seemed like he might simply fade out of the social landscape entirely, suspended from everything that had once defined him, watching his father's business absorb a loss that changed the tenor of dinner conversations at home for weeks. But he'd shown up to his mandated conflict resolution counseling every session without missing one, and somewhere in December, without any real fanfare, he'd started showing up to the Third Table meetings too. Not as a leader, not asking for credit, just sitting in the back and listening, then eventually helping, then eventually being the one who noticed a freshman eating alone in the corner and pulled up a chair without being asked. Marcus hadn't fully let his guard down around him. He still measured his words when Tyler was in the room, still watched him a beat longer than he watched most people. But 3 months was enough time to notice a pattern of its own, a different one this time, steadier, quieter, consistent in a way the old Tyler never had been. At the gym, Coach Doss had noticed something too, though it took him longer to name it. Marcus had always trained with discipline, but there was something different in him since October. Not anger, never anger, that wasn't Marcus's nature, but a kind of settled confidence that hadn't fully been there before. Like a boy who'd been tested in the one arena where his training didn't apply, and had passed it without needing anyone to tell him he had. "You did good," Doss told him one evening in late January, toweling sweat off his own forehead after a hard mid-session, the gym mostly empty around them. "Not the boxing. That, obviously, I already knew about. I mean the other part. The part where you didn't need the boxing at all." Marcus wrapped his hands slowly, methodically, the way he always did, and didn't answer right away. "Didn't feel like I had a choice," he said eventually. "Felt like the only thing I could do." "That's exactly what discipline is," Doss said. "Doing the hard thing because it's right, not because it's easy." He nodded toward the ring behind them, empty under the fluorescent lights. "You've got a big one coming up in March." Citywide exhibition. A lot of eyes gonna be on you now, more than there would have been before all this. Marcus looked toward the ring for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his calm expression. Not nerves exactly, but something close to anticipation. "I'm ready," he said. The Cleveland Amateur Boxing Association's citywide exhibition took place on the second Saturday in March, inside the fieldhouse at Cuyahoga Community College's East Campus, a space usually reserved for basketball scrimmages and community fitness classes, transformed for one night into something closer to a proper arena. Folding bleachers had been wheeled in on both sides of a raised ring at the center of the gym floor, the canvas painted a deep navy with the CABA logo stitched into each corner, ropes wrapped in red, white, and blue for the occasion. Overhead, the fieldhouse's usual fluorescent panels had been supplemented with four portable stage lights angled down at the ring, throwing everything outside the ropes into a kind of soft, expectant dimness. By 6:30, when the doors opened to the public, the bleachers were already filling faster than the volunteers at the entrance table had expected. Marcus's fight, the co-main event of the evening, 3 rounds against a 16-year-old out of Akron with a reputation of his own, a rangy southpaw named Deshaun Ellis, who'd been unbeaten through his last 11 bouts, had drawn more advance interest than any amateur card the CABA had put on in years. Part of that was simple boxing pedigree. 2 undefeated regional prospects, both being watched by the same handful of Olympic development scouts, in what most serious observers considered the most competitive matchup on the card. But everyone in that fieldhouse, whether they followed amateur boxing closely or had never watched a match in their life, knew the other reason the crowd had swelled the way it had. The Cafeteria video had crossed 3 million views by January. A follow-up local news segment in February, this one naming Marcus, with his mother's permission, framed around the Third Table Initiative rather than the bullying itself, had pushed his name further outside the small circle of people who followed regional amateur boxing and into a wider, more curious public. Half the people filing into the bleachers that Saturday weren't boxing fans at all. They were people who'd watched a 15-year-old absorb chili and milk and humiliation without flinching, who'd read about the program his composure had helped start, and who wanted now to see for themselves what he actually was capable of when the constraint was finally lifted. Denise Webb sat in the third row, close enough to see her son's face clearly once he climbed into the ring, close enough that he'd be able to find her in the crowd the way he always did before a fight, a habit from his very first bout at 12 years old, locating her face for one steadying second before the referee called the fighters to the center. Beside her sat Coach Doss, already in his cornerman's vest, running through the fight plan in his head one more time, even though he'd gone over it with Marcus a dozen times that week already. Priya Anand had come too, seated a few rows back with 2 friends from the third table group, having never watched a live boxing match in her life and having decided, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wasn't going to miss this one. And near the back of the bleachers, in a section that hadn't been assigned to him and that he'd chosen deliberately, sat Tyler Brennan. He'd asked Marcus, tentatively, 2 weeks earlier, whether it would be strange for him to come. Marcus had thought about it for a moment, the 2 of them standing at the edge of the third table meeting room after a Wednesday session, and told him it wouldn't be strange at all, that he was welcome, same as anyone else who wanted to watch. It wasn't friendship, exactly, what had grown between them over the winter. Marcus still measured his words around Tyler more than he did around most people, still carried a caution that hadn't fully dissolved and maybe never fully would. But it was something real, something built slowly out of 5 months of consistent, unglamorous effort on Tyler's part. Showing up, listening, doing the quiet work of becoming a different person in 100 small moments nobody was filming. Marcus had come to believe it, even if he hadn't come to forget the reason it was necessary in the first place. When Marcus's name was announced, asterisk in the red corner out of Cleveland, Ohio, with a record of 19 wins and 0 losses. Marcus Webb. Asterisk. The fieldhouse erupted in a way that surprised even the CABA officials running the card. It wasn't the polite applause of a typical amateur bout. It was loud, sustained, the kind of noise that came from people who'd shown up specifically to see this particular fighter, who'd followed a story that had nothing to do with boxing and everything to do with the character the boxing had quietly built in him. Marcus climbed through the ropes in his red trunks and gray East Side boxing robe, found his mother's face in the third row for his customary half second, and then turned toward his corner, expression settling into the same still, focused calm that had carried him through a cafeteria full of humiliation 5 months earlier. Except now, for the first time in a long while, it was exactly the right setting for it. The fight itself was competitive from the opening bell. Deshaun Ellis was fast, technically sound. A southpaw who made Marcus work hard for angles in the first round and landed a sharp counter left in the second that snapped Marcus's head back and drew a small, appreciative roar from the Akron side of the crowd. But Marcus had spent 3 years building exactly the kind of composure that a moment like that called for. He didn't rush, didn't chase the mistake with something reckless, just reset his feet, tightened his guard, and went back to the fundamentals Doss had drilled into him since he was 12. By the third round, Marcus's body work had slowed Ellis down enough to open the angles he needed, and a combination up top in the final 30 seconds, the same kind of body-to-head sequence that had ended his August regional bout, sent Ellis briefly to one knee before the bell rang to end the round. The decision, when it came, went to Marcus unanimously, 20-0. The fieldhouse noise that followed wasn't just for the win. It was for everything the win represented to a room full of people who'd followed the story from a cafeteria floor to this ring, and Marcus, glove still on, robe draped back over his shoulders, allowed himself something he rarely did in public, a full, unguarded smile, first toward his mother in the third row, and then briefly toward the back of the bleachers, where Tyler stood clapping along with everyone else. No performance in it at all this time, just genuine, uncomplicated support for someone he'd once tried to break. Afterward, outside the fieldhouse, in the cold March air with his gym bag over his shoulder and his mother's arm looped through his, Marcus stopped for a moment and looked back at the building, its windows still lit against the dark parking lot, the last of the crowd filtering out in loud, satisfied conversation. "Feels different," he said quietly, mostly to himself. Being seen for the right reason, for once. His mother squeezed his arm. "It always was the right reason," she said. The world just had to catch up to it. 6 months later, by late August, the story of Marcus Webb and the Third Table Initiative had traveled a good deal further than anyone at Lincoln High School could have predicted back in October, when a 15-year-old silence in a cafeteria line had first started circulating on a handful of local Cleveland accounts. What had begun as a single viral video had become, over the better part of a year, something closer to a template, a program other schools wanted for themselves. Once they heard how it had actually changed the daily texture of life inside Lincoln High's cafeteria. The first outside interest came from a middle school 20 minutes north, in Euclid, whose principal had reached out to Denise Carver in April after reading the local news follow-up piece on the program. Carver had been careful, in that first conversation, to make clear that the Third Table Initiative wasn't a magic fix, wasn't something you could bolt onto any school and expect identical results. It had grown out of a specific, painful set of circumstances, and its success depended on students actually believing in it, not just being assigned to it. But the bones of the idea were transferable, she told the Euclid principal. Train student volunteers to notice, not police. Give them real authority to intervene without turning them into another layer of institutional discipline. And build a culture where stepping in was treated as ordinary, not heroic. By June, 2 more schools in the district had launched their own versions, one at a middle school on the west side, one at a second high school across town, each adapted to fit its own building, its own students, its own particular flavor of the problem every school eventually has to face in one form or another. Dominic Reyes, the sophomore who'd first suggested the program's name, had been invited to speak to a small gathering of student council representatives from all 3 schools that summer, laying out what had worked and what hadn't, speaking with the particular authority of someone who'd lived through the thing he was describing rather than read about it in a training manual. He mentioned Marcus by name exactly once in his talk, briefly, almost in passing. By then, the program had genuinely outgrown its origin story, had become something the volunteers who ran it thought of as their own, which was, Carver would later say, the clearest sign that it had actually worked. Marcus hadn't sought out any of the attention that followed the CABA exhibition in March. If anything, he'd grown more careful about it, more protective of the ordinary shape of his life, even as that life had become harder to keep entirely private. He'd finished out his freshman year with the same quiet discipline he'd carried into it. Up at 5:15 most mornings, 3 miles before school, homework finished in the gaps between other obligations, a boy who still ate lunch at the third table closest to the exit, though now, more often than not, that table was crowded with other kids who'd found their way there over the course of the year, drawn less by his fame than by the simple fact that it had become, without anyone officially declaring it so, one of the more comfortable places in the cafeteria to sit. His boxing record stood at 23-0 by the time August rolled around. 3 more wins added since the March exhibition, including a statement victory at the Ohio State Championships in June that had solidified his place on the shortlist for the USA Boxing Youth National Team. Coach Doss, never a man given to easy praise, had told a regional sports reporter following that win that Marcus Webb was the most disciplined 15-year-old I've trained in 30 years in this gym, and that discipline shows up everywhere, not just between the ropes. Frank Delgado, the same reporter whose comment on the original viral video had set off the chain of events that led to the reveal back in October, had become something of an informal chronicler of Marcus's amateur career since, covering his fights with a mixture of professional interest and the particular investment of someone who'd been present, however indirectly, at the beginning of a larger story. Tyler Brennan's own year had taken a shape nobody, least of all Tyler, could have fully predicted back in October. He'd served his suspension, completed his conflict resolution counseling, and returned to Lincoln High in November, changed in ways that were subtle at first and then, over months, unmistakable. He'd been reinstated to basketball for his junior season, made the team, though he no longer carried himself on the court or in the hallways with the same performative volume he once had. Something had been dialed down in him, replaced by something quieter, and most people who knew him agreed, considerably more genuine. He'd stayed involved with the Third Table initiative straight through the spring and into the summer, eventually taking on a coordinating role alongside Dominic for the following school year, helping train the newest round of volunteer students on the exact kind of situation he himself had once been the cause of. His father's construction business had spent the spring rebuilding what the winter had cost it. Brennan Construction, having lost its district facilities contract, had pivoted toward residential work, slower and less lucrative but steadier. And by summer Dale Brennan had begun quietly bidding on smaller municipal contracts again, this time under considerably more scrutiny than before, and considerably more careful about the work itself. Whatever conversations had happened inside the Brennan household that winter, Tyler never discussed them in detail with anyone at school, but the change in him was evident enough that even skeptical observers, the kind who'd assumed his transformation was a performance calculated to salvage his own reputation, eventually stopped waiting for the old Tyler to resurface. Kevin Ostrander, still, 5 years later in the retelling of this story around Lincoln High, the kid Marcus helped up to anyone who'd been in that cafeteria the day of the tray incident, had become one of the Third Table Initiative's most committed volunteers, the first to notice when a table's dynamic started shifting toward something unkind, the first to pull up a chair. He credited the whole thing, when asked, to a single image that had stuck with him longer than the humiliation of his own fall. Marcus's hand extended toward him in the middle of his own worst moment, steady and unbothered, asking nothing in return. Priya Anand had gone on to write about the whole episode for the school newspaper in the spring, a longer piece than the paper usually ran, tracing the story from the first tripping incident through the founding of the initiative, careful and even-handed in a way that surprised even Principal Carver when she read the draft. It was the piece, more than the original viral video, that most of the students at Lincoln High would remember years later as the actual record of what had happened, not the humiliation, but everything that had been built out of it afterward. On a warm evening in late August, a week before the start of his sophomore year, Marcus sat on the back steps of his house with his mother, watching the last of the daylight fade over the row of houses across the street, a glass of lemonade sweating in his hand. He'd spent the afternoon at the gym, same as always, and the ordinary rhythm of the day, training, homework, dinner, this quiet stretch on the steps before bed, felt, in a way it hadn't quite felt in months, entirely his own again. You ever think about it? His mother asked. That whole fall, how it all started. Marcus considered the question for a moment, the way he considered most things, unhurried. Sometimes, he said, not the bad parts really, more just, how much came out of it? That wasn't bad. The program. Kevin. Even Tyler, I guess, though I never would have predicted that part. You didn't do any of that by fighting back, his mother said. It wasn't quite a question either. No, Marcus agreed. I did it by not fighting back. By just staying who I already was, and letting that be enough. He turned the glass slowly in his hand, watching the light catch the condensation on the outside of it. People kept waiting for me to prove something with my hands. Turns out I didn't need to. The proof was already there, in just not needing to. His mother didn't say anything to that, just reached over and rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. The two of them sitting in the quiet the way they often did, needing very little said between them to understand each other completely. Somewhere across the city that same evening, a middle schooler in Euclid, new to a program built on principles she didn't fully know the origin of yet, would notice a classmate sitting alone at lunch the following week and, without much thought at all, simply pull up a chair beside him. One small, ordinary act, rippling outward from a cafeteria floor in Cleveland that nobody in that Euclid lunchroom had ever seen, carrying forward a lesson that had never once needed to be loud to be heard. There's a particular kind of strength that never announces itself. And if you've watched this story unfold from that first cafeteria trip to a boy standing in a ring 6 months later with his hand raised in victory, you already understand exactly what that strength looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a single dramatic moment where Marcus Webb turned around, revealed who he really was, and made everyone who'd wronged him regret it in an instant. It was slower than that, and in a lot of ways harder than that, a 15-year-old boy choosing, day after day, humiliation after humiliation, to hold on to the discipline he'd spent years building, even when every part of him would have been justified in letting it go. That's really what this story was about, underneath everything else. Not the boxing record, though 23-0 is nothing to overlook. Not even the reveal itself. Satisfying as it was to watch Tyler Brennan's confidence crumble the moment Coach Doss walked into that office with a folder full of proof that the ghost kid he'd been humiliating for weeks was quietly one of the most gifted young fighters in the state. The real story was about what Marcus did with the power he had the entire time. The choice made over and over not to use it. Real strength, the story keeps insisting, was never about what Marcus could have done to Tyler in that cafeteria. It was about what he chose to do instead. Pick up his tray, help a stranger off the floor, and walk away without a word, trusting that the truth would come out on its own terms, in its own time. And it did. But notice how it came out, not through Marcus bragging, not through some dramatic confrontation where he finally told Tyler exactly who he was and watched him squirm. It came out through circumstance, through a reporter who happened to recognize a face, through a coach who walked into an office at exactly the right moment with exactly the right proof. Marcus never needed to reveal himself because he never once compromised who he already was. That's the difference between someone performing strength and someone who actually has it. The story also asks something harder of us than just admiring Marcus, though. It asks us to think about Tyler. Two, not to excuse what he did, because nothing excuses weeks of targeted cruelty towards someone who never gave him a reason for it, but to notice what actually changed him. It wasn't punishment alone. The suspension, the lost basketball season, even his father's business losing that contract, none of that by itself would have made Tyler into someone who spent his Wednesdays training the next round of third-table volunteers. What changed him was being given, after all of it, a real chance to become someone different and choosing consistently, quietly, without an audience this time, to take it. Marcus's response to Tyler's apology on that porch back in October wasn't forgiveness handed out cheaply. It was something better and more honest, an open door with no promises attached, and the simple truth that change has to be proven over time, not announced in a single moment. That's the moral this story leaves us with, if it leaves us with just one thing. Dignity doesn't need volume to be real, and change doesn't need to be instant to be genuine. Marcus never raised his voice, never threw a punch outside the ring where punches belonged, and by the end of it, he didn't just win his own story back. He built something that outlasted it, a program now running in 3 schools across Cleveland, started by kids who understood, because they'd lived it, exactly what it costs to stay silent while someone else gets hurt, and exactly what it's worth to finally not be silent anymore. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why I make these, to remind us all that the quietest people in the room are sometimes carrying the most weight, and that real power rarely needs to announce itself to be undeniable. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a like on this video if Marcus's story hit you the way it hit me putting it together. I read every single comment, so let me know down below what part of this one stuck with you the most. Was it the tray, the reveal in that office, or that final moment on the porch? And if you're not ready to leave yet, good, because I've got 2 more stories lined up that I think you're going to want to see. Up next, a story about a woman wrongly accused in front of an entire retail store, who says nothing in her own defense until the exact right moment, when a single phone call changes everything the people around her thought they knew. And after that, one that I've been sitting on for weeks because I think it might be one of the best reveals I've ever written, about a soft-spoken delivery driver, dismissed and disrespected by everyone he meets on his route, until the day someone finally recognizes exactly who he used to be and why he chose deliberately to disappear into a quiet life instead. Both of those are coming up right after this one, so stay close. Thank you, truly, for watching all the way to the end of this one. Stories like Marcus's only work because people like you take the time to sit with them, to care about a fictional 15-year-old boy's discipline and dignity as much as if he were standing right in front of you. That means more than you probably know. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, you don't have to be loud to be strong.